Hello. Today I'm going to read to you a really fun story that's called Don't Be Silly, Mrs. Millie by Judy Cox, illustrated by Joe Matthew. The illustrations are really fun to look at, and also think of what she's saying because she's been really silly with her words. Mrs. Millie, our teacher, is really silly. Every day she says, "Good morning, children. Please hang up your goats." What do you think she means? Not goat, she means coats. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our coats. At 8 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Please rise for the frog salute." "Oh no," we shout. "You mean flag salute." It's 9 o'clock. Time to write, Mrs. Millie says. "Get out your paper and penguins." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our paper and pencils." As I'm reading this, you should try to guess what she really means before I say it. Can you do that? At 10 o'clock, it's recess time. Our teacher looks out the window. "It just stopped raining, cats and dogs. Don't step in a poodle." "Don't you mean a puddle?" we ask, giggling. We play outside until our teacher blows her whistle. "Recess is over," she yells. "It's time to chameleon." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean it's time to come in." At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Millie says, "You may get drinks, but don't cut in the lion." "You mean the line," we yell. At 12 o'clock, our teacher announces, "Time for lunch. Wash your hands with soap and walrus." "You're silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean soap and water." As we get in line, Mrs. Millie reminds us, "Don't forget your lunch bunny." "Oh, that's right. Our lunch money," we shout. Mrs. Millie puts on her glasses to read the menu. "They have gorilla cheese sandwiches today." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean grilled cheese sandwiches." Look at the gorilla. That would be not a yummy sandwich. At 1 o'clock, our teacher picks up a book. "It's story time. Come sit on the bug." "You're so silly," we cry. "You mean sit on the rug." At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Millie calls us to the back of the room. "It's time for art. Who wants to paint on the weasel?" "You mean the easel, Mrs. Millie. How can you be so silly?" we ask. After our art teacher asks, "Who's hungry?" we have parrot sticks and quackers. "We know what you mean, carrot sticks and crackers," we yell. At 3 o'clock, Mrs. Millie smiles. "What a fun day we've had, but it's time to go home. Put on your bats and kittens." "Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean our hats and mittens." When we're ready to leave, our teacher goes to the door. "Butterfly, children." "No, Mrs. Millie," we shout. "You don't mean butterfly. You mean goodbye." Mrs. Millie laughs. We laugh too. "Butterfly, Mrs. Millie. See you, gator." And we wave goodbye as we get on the octopus. What a fun day at school, huh? I hope you enjoyed the story, and I will see you in the next read along.